Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Conversations podcast. My name is Patrycja Rozwora and I'm the host of this platform where we speak about contemporary art from so-called Eastern Europe. In each episode, you're going to be introduced to one artist or researcher whose visual or activist practice sheds light onto the complex former socialist region with all its histories, cultures, languages, foods, but also traumas and their inevitable contemporary consequences. The podcast is a fully independent platform existing since May 2020. If you enjoy the monthly conversations and want to leave me a motivating feedback, you can now go to buymeacoffee.com/kitchenconversations and show your support by buying me a symbolic coffee. All the needed links you can find in the show notes of this episode. Welcome back to Kitchen Conversations. Hope you had a great summer and are slowly settling into the new season, enjoying the calmer and cooler part of this year. Since I'm hosting 4 wonderful guests today, I will keep my intro short and leave them the space to introduce themselves and the project. After a successful episode about the Romanian pavilion at this year's Venice Biennale, I decided to make one more for you, this time about the Bulgarian pavilion. The Neighbours is an interactive multimedia installation that brings to light the silenced and faded memories of survivors of political violence during communist era in Bulgaria. The project was created by Krasimira Butseva, who was already a guest on this podcast, Lilia Topouzova and Julian Chehirian. Vasil Vladimirov is the project's curator in the context of Bulgaria's official participation in the 60th Venice Biennale.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us. We're really glad to be here. My name is Krasimira Butseva and I am a visual artist, researcher and educator based between Sofia and London.
My name is Julian Chehirian and I'm a multimedia artist and a researcher. I'm a historian, more specifically, and I live between Philadelphia and Sofia.
Thank you so much for having us. My name is Lilia Topouzova. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm a writer, historian, a filmmaker, and I am also somehow, like every other member of this team, in between worlds, trying to make sense of them.
Thanks for having us. My name is Vasil Vladimirov. I'm a curator and I'm based in Sofia.
Cool, welcome. It's somehow even more special because Krasimira, you were of course on this podcast already, and it kind of makes me realize that I'm already doing it for quite some time when I have already a guest coming for the second time here. That makes me super happy also to meet you in person today and to bring all the other people with you. We are here, of course, on the occasion, let's say, of your visit to Berlin. That is connected to the Bulgarian pavilion that you were working on and since April showing your work at the Venice Biennale. And I think it's amazing. Congratulations also to bring such important topics to the Biennale. And the podcast is, of course, dedicated to this exhibition, to this work, and to the process of it. The first thing would be to somehow introduce the project for those who didn't go to the Biennale yet and who have not heard about the Neighbours yet.
The Neighbours, which is representing Bulgaria at the 60th Venice Biennale, is a multimedia installation that is based on our long-standing collaborative research on the history, memory, and legacy of political violence in the state socialist period and its aftermath in Bulgaria. And the installation comprises 3 domestic spaces, 3 domestic environments that evoke our research, that contain fragments from our oral history interviews with survivors of state-led violence in Bulgaria, forced labor and political repression. And these domestic environments, which are more specifically a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen, they essentially configure 3 different ways, categories, or styles of remembering and forgetting this traumatic inheritance, which in the way that we see it is not something that is an individuated experience, but is a collective inheritance for contemporary Bulgaria. part of the way that we've approached this work is to think about history not purely through questions of facticity and the archival record, but to think about how do we investigate histories that have been effaced, obfuscated, purged deliberately by the institutions that actually create the paper trails that we attempt to use to recover the past. And so our contemporary glance at the history of state-led violence in Bulgaria is very much informed by how researchers, interdisciplinary researchers have worked with traumatic memory. The project itself is very much an accumulation and an amalgamation of all of our individual practices. Maybe we can each sort of say a little bit about how we came into this work.
Exactly, that would be my second or following up question. How does a group of like 4 people work on one project, and how each of your expertise kind of come together? Because from knowing your work a bit, Krasimira, I know that you've been busy with this history and this topic for a long time, also in your own practice. So I'm curious how each of your works also come into that one exhibition that you created.
We can say that the research begins in 2003. That's when I started looking into the topic. Although, now that I was revising the introduction of my book, in fact, of course, it began before. You could date it back to the early 2000s. But, I bought a one-way ticket from Toronto to Sofia in 2003 to learn more about the experience of forced labor camps, both by people who perpetrated atrocities, but also by the survivors themselves. So I began looking into this through oral history, field work on the former sites of violence themselves, and through archival research in 2003. That's when the work began. And then we formed the collective in 2014. And we began thinking about how to represent the silenced histories that we came across and that we collected. Now, to answer your question, how each of us comes together, when you think of collective work, it's very difficult to see what each individual member contributes because especially when you enter the pavilion, you enter already a very formed space. And it's a formed space through material artifacts, through sound, through video, but also intellectually formed space. So you already come into one finished product, and it's very difficult to see, okay, this is what this person contributed, or this is what that person contributed. And I think actually that's the whole point of working in a collective. In a sense, yes, you could
categorize... successful collective.
Exactly. You could categorize each of us and say, okay, this is the scholar behind the work. This is the visual artist behind the work. This is the sound artist behind the work. This is the curator. But this does not do justice to the actual collaborative process that yields the type of work that, people will see once they enter the Bulgarian pavilion, the Biennale. I think all of us often say that, this is a collective trauma. This is an experience that doesn't impact solely people who were in forced labor camps. It impacts their families, impacts their communities, and it impacts society writ large. And by society, I don't mean just Bulgarian society, I mean society in general. And I think that the only way to address collective trauma is by forming a collective. And I think the idea behind this project is that you create a space and you hold the space. And you make possible for people to enter the space and experience it.
I started working on this topic in 2016. I didn't know any of these people in this room sitting here. I started alone and started by trying out to work with archives, trying out to find some books to read, like there was barely anything. And then I reached some of these spaces to photograph and film. And later I reached some of these people who had been interned into the camps. Mainly I spoke to their families or to local people. And then I met Lilia a few years later, and in our first ever conversation, which was on Skype, we just spoke about the very same physical, bodily, emotional experience that we've had, just with a 10-year gap between the time when I entered the city and the time when she entered the very same city. We quickly figured out that we were both women who would come from a different country where we would be based outside of Bulgaria, and we would come in cities where we're not from, where we don't belong in a way, or where we're seen as outsiders. And we would try to ask these questions, and the way the questions or us as a whole would be met in the same very way, through kind of silence or people not really wanting to speak about the topic, even though they've agreed to meet with you, and they still avoid it. So for us, this was very kind of impactful to kind of meet and very quickly figure out that we have experienced the same thing. So nothing much has changed in the span of these 10 years between when she started doing her research and I was starting to do my own.
And the title of your work, The Neighbours, when you came here upstairs and you rang and you said it's The Neighbours, I thought I had such a good feeling. I don't know, it's such a positive word, or at least in my feeling, when you introduce yourselves through the doorbell here. I'm curious about the choice of calling this part of the project, because of course it's a research that is kind of started long ago and is continuing, but the work at the Biennale, the presentation you decided to call The Neighbours. So curious to hear about that. Maybe Vasil can speak about that.
But what you said as an introduction to this question, I found really interesting, because it was me and Julian downstairs and we rang the bell and you didn't know us, you knew only Krasimira. I didn't know if you knew our names before that. So in order not to say a random name like Vasil or Julian, I had to think a little bit and I was like, I'll just say it's The Neighbours. And I think this talks about this idea of how universal this history is, and I think it relates to the title, why it is called The Neighbours, because I think someone will mention that everyone is the neighbor, everyone knows the neighbors, and it's something familiar and something
or not
that you can relate.
In a big city, I think in Berlin, you don't know your neighbors.
Exactly.
Although they live just next to you. And I think that's
when
also...
I said The Neighbours, I wondered, didn't I just freak her out saying it's The Neighbours and maybe there is a leak or a problem?
Slightly, yes. But then I was like, okay, I mean, it's time. You're supposed to come for an interview, so kind of...
So this is, an anecdotal answer from just 5 minutes ago of why more or less it is called The Neighbours. But maybe someone else can add something.
I think that's pretty much the answer in general, because it's also what you just said, how you could know the neighbors, or you may have never known who the neighbors are. And I think one of the reasons for the name is about thinking about how the scale of political violence and repression that was happening in socialist Bulgaria was so large, and it's so hard to even determine the scale in a way, because the archives were purged, that you can kind of speculate that everyone has a neighbor that has been affected, basically. But because all of these stories have remained in the homes of the people, they never exited them. They never became a part of a public space in history museums or in a memorial on the street. They continued to exist still in the homes of these people. So it's only these very thin walls that separate you from your neighbors that may live with these stories daily.
Also, you yourself are a neighbor, in a sense that everyone is a neighbor and everyone has neighbors. And so The Neighbours as a title makes possible for people to identify on both ends. And in a sense, it's not a pointing a finger at someone and categorizing them and saying you're guilty or you're innocent. It is simply saying that this is a shared experience. And that's what it means. It doesn't mean you know your neighbors. Maybe you choose not to know them. What we have begun doing, and I think Vasco very, aptly described it, that we have begun also calling ourselves The Neighbours. So The Neighbours is not simply the title of our project, but it's us, and we have a very, very large team of people now who have become part of the collective, who are contributing to the project that is The Neighbours.
Krasimira, you mentioned that one of the tools of creating this work and this research was interviews. Also in your press release, I'm reading that you conducted around 40 interviews, or maybe more or less. Probably more, yeah. Can we hear those interviews in the exhibition? What part is part of your work? Is it the words themselves? Is it the voices of those people? Who did you interview?
So in the Bulgarian pavilion in Venice, you can hear excerpts from the interviews that me and Lily conducted. However, the interviews in Venice are dubbed by actors, so they're all in English. You can also hear our voices. We ask questions or we say something sometimes so that you can kind of understand it's a conversation, not a monologue or something that has been kind of written beforehand and read out loud from someone. In the first iteration of the installation, when we showed it in 2022 in Bulgaria, the interviews were in Bulgarian, and it was the actual kind of original files that we recorded. But for the Biennale, we decided to translate them so that we can allow for further accessibility of the work. Inside of the pavilion, you hear the voices of 8 people. 4 of them I've interviewed, the other 4 Lily has interviewed. They share very different stories from one another, although sometimes there are kind of intersections between the reasons of their imprisonment or their experiences of being in the camp or leaving the camp and coming home. You hear very short parts. You hear somewhere between 30 seconds to 3 minutes per file. Some of them are very much not historical. Some of the interviews or the excerpts from the interviews are these very small silent stories of someone coming home and how they're kind of seen by their family or what they feel when they enter their house. The main parts aren't really about the survivors narrating the years in which they were sent to the camp and doing like kind of a historiography of their experiences. It's kind of very different. We've really spent some time thinking about how to create an installation which could be accessible to someone that may not know where Bulgaria even is, what for the history of Bulgaria. I think there is often this problem with historical exhibitions or exhibitions dealing with history that are in contemporary art museums, where the viewer may feel that they need to read like these 10 books before they enter the space. So if I'm the viewer, I wouldn't even enter. But maybe Lily can say a bit more about the interviews themselves.
The interviews that we chose, in a way, are representative of the 3 ways of remembering in the 3 spaces that Julian explained earlier. And so we have chosen people who speak to the broader community that we have worked with for so many years. In terms of the individuals themselves, we have people who are generally on the former non-communist left, meaning you have people who are part of the Agrarian Union, Social Democrats, and anarchists. These were the people, for instance, who opposed the Stalinization of communist Bulgaria. And there are the people who resisted, but again, there are people who remain firmly on the left. And they were sent usually without a trial or sentenced to forced labor camps. We also have the voice of somebody who was, at the time of the interview in 2011, he was 69 years old. He was actually 17 when he was sent, 18 when he was sent to a forced labor camp. And he was just, an ordinary teenager who listened to Western music and was obsessed with the West. And so we have tried to have as many people as possible who speak to the broader categories of people who were sent to camps. We also have tried to include as many women and women's voices that we have. We have few. We know very little about women's experiences, but so we try to emphasize as well the very few kind of narratives we have of women. And again, you hear only a fragment of what we have been told, but I think the point that we have tried to emphasize from the very beginning is that this is not about conveying historical information, but it is about conveying lived experiences. And so in order for you to kind of be in the space and to be able to bear witness, whether you know the exact facts of somebody was interned in 1951 or 1953 is not as relevant. But what happens to that person, what happens to that person's family, and what happens to the world in which that person lives is much more important to us. And that's why you hear so much of our voices. And that's why you hear so much that is not at all relevant about the camps themselves. And sometimes I think what it really matters are the kind of the sighs and the whispers, the in-betweens.
The breaks.
The breaks, the pauses. Just like when you began this interview, you said, the noise doesn't bother me. The noise doesn't bother me, you said, because, I don't mind you drinking and I don't mind you leafing through papers. And that's what, I often felt. And I think Krasimira felt the same way when we recorded interviews. The kind of recorder I had at the beginning allowed me initially to filter out the white noise. There was a kind of a button that you could press. And I decided not to press it because sometimes all you have is white noise. And that is very valuable in and of itself. You just, it takes a while to learn to listen to it and understand it. But it's a form of evidence.
Maybe an obvious after question, but I have to ask, why weren't the voices of women not so present in your interviews? Or why didn't you gather the same amount of female stories and non-female stories?
Because women don't talk. Women don't want to go on the record. In fact, very few people want to go on the record. Krasimira and I, through the years, have met with hundreds of people, and they're not people who wanted to be recorded. So the very few interviews that we have recorded, again, represent a very small minority. There are many reasons why women don't want to talk. One of our speculations, of course, is sexual violence. But that, again, that is only a speculation. But women do not go on the record as much, and there is a kind of an imparity there between, the narratives we have, and they're very different narratives. And so we have to work with what we have.
Mm. And now we spoke quite some about the research process and about the historical part of your work, but I'm also curious for the audience and the listeners of the podcast to kind of visualize what they can expect the exhibition. I think it's always nice to have the balance, especially in a audio format, a podcast format, to kind of move the imagination a bit. And I saw some visuals. I haven't been yet at the Biennale. Maybe I'll manage. Let's see. If you could speak about how you translated the broad research into the visual, and what can audience at the Bulgarian Pavilion expect, or like how the space looks and what is there to see and feel.
This feels like a collaborative answer here. I'll begin, and then maybe I'll hand it off to our curator, Vasil, and then perhaps Krasimira and Lilia might have something that they also want to say. Yeah, so one enters into the Bulgarian Pavilion and finds themselves in the midst of a living room, an everyday space. Quite normal, especially considering that the material world of this space is very much of a genre of furniture and objects that come from the post-war period in Bulgaria. You have modular furniture. The wood grain is kind of like a fractal. Every object in it is part almost of a visual rhythm. It projects a sort of deep familiarity. As you spend more time in the space, you begin to notice things that are maybe not quite right, or that don't necessarily quite add up to the way in which domestic spaces tend to be spaces of representation. The living room is a space where you spend time by yourself, but it's also a space where you welcome guests, neighbors, visitors. And in that sense, domestic spaces, something that art historians will frequently talk about is how domestic spaces are spaces where we sort of organize our world, not just for ourselves, but also to invite others into it. And there are these silences and disruptions, and also these conspicuous presences. There's an object, a rock, that sort of interrupts the familiar pattern of doilies and vases and plants. And these little kind of murmurs and noises and disruptions begin to lead visitors into other patterns that are, in a sense, commingling in the space. And I've spoken about the first room, about the initial immersion. I'll pass it on to Vasil.
To speak about the two other room representations.
Yes, Julie managed to explain it very eloquently and to transport us there, almost to experience it vividly.
Totally, yeah.
And visually. I will take a step back, and I will take us back to the entrance to the pavilion. And I would say you enter the pavilion, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. It is something that a lot of people have remarked, and it is something that it is intentional but not controlled, because each object inside, like all the rocks, all the grass, all the moss, all the old furniture, brings brings a smell with it, and it speaks as a metaphor to this history. It's something that it's really complex. It's part of a lot of different situations and scenarios and personal histories which converge and create one whole narrative, which still remains kind of fragmented but yet intertwined. Then fast forward to the second room after Julie described the first one. Then you enter the bedroom. There you see kind of like a normal setting of a one-bedroom apartment of a person who most probably lives by themselves. There is a bed. From the bed there is like grass coming out, and on the top of the bed, where like one would probably hold a book or a bottle or a glass of water, there is jars full of water of the Danube, where one of the camps used to be situated, the Belene camp. Then in the middle of the room there is a sewing machine which violently turns on and off sporadically, either before or after the voice of Nadezhda, who was one of the women who was interned in the camps. Like with all the furniture and material world, it's also disrupted by noises and video projections, which again turn on and off, evoking some kind of presence. And these are video recordings of, again, the places where the camps once used to be. Then you go into the kitchen, which is the room where you don't hear any voices. It's rather ambient sounds from domestic places, like you would hear footsteps or like water running. You would think there would be someone, but actually there is no one there. It looks like the flat was left abruptly, like without being tidied up, and everything would be painted in white and covered in liquid latex, kind of representing this silence and this blankness, which in a space that is absolutely dark. I don't know if we mentioned that, but the place is dark and there is only ambient light and the light
all of the three spaces?
All of the three spaces. And the third space somehow like speaks the most because of being white, because it's most visible, yet it gives you very little factual information because it's just noise and visuals and no words or sentences or coherent thoughts.
Yeah, so it's dark. There is light, of course. It's domestic kind of chandeliers that you would see in a flat that are suspended from the ceiling at points. There are other lights sometimes. Sometimes some of them turn on and off. Multiple objects turn on and off in the installation because it's running in this choreographed way where there is something happening in the first room for 5 minutes, then something happens in the second room for 5 minutes, then again the kitchen kind of moves on its own. So we've kind of choreographed this experience where the viewers kind of investigate what's happening and are dragged through the space because of the sound or the light or projector starting. There are loads of gaps between the different things that happen so that you can kind of look around the space and have a pause. There's also an ambient sound running through the whole time, so it's actually never really silent completely. The ambient sound is a mix between field recordings from the sites of the camps of birds, crickets, water running. There are sounds that we've composed together with Julian of glasses moving, things happening in the domestic space. So it's this kind of an interlink between the site of the camps and the site of someone's home. So you hear like this presence all around in the whole space. In the kitchen, you hear it coming from some of the furniture, like some the speakers are hidden in the furniture and you don't really see where things are happening from. You kind of notice them around you, and I think often the visitors would say they're really confused where the sound is coming from, really confused where this is happening. People would sometimes think that with their bodies they activate things just because to be a complete coincidence that they would start walking and something would start playing instantly. So I think we've kind of tried to not only create this choreographed experience, which is a little bit like a performance of a house, but we've also tried to kind of direct people around but leave them to experience the space on their own. And then there's loads of, as it was mentioned, rocks and moss and branches. All of that are artifacts we've collected from the sites of the camps in the past 4 years or something, and they're kind of spread around. And as you go from the first room to the last room, things become more and more disrupted. When you enter and you look at the first room, there is like 2 armchairs, a television, glass cabinet. Everything looks pretty normal and pretty familiar until you hear the voices. But as you start to move further and further, you see that the rooms look like rooms, but this coziness or like this feeling of a home has been disappearing more and more. Suddenly all of the artifacts in like a glass Soviet vitrine are not precious glasses. They are burnt pieces of wood and rocks that are placed as careful as someone would place their glasses, but are like all of these very different and disturbing, almost like artifacts.
How much information do you give to the viewers about all this you just mentioned? And how much do you want them just to feel and experience and imagine their own narratives and stories? And how much is it for you important to really know what, for example, the vitrine means?
Well, as every exhibition, there is a text which is like a statement and tells you about the concept, some very brief historical context. Then we have also produced a small brochure which then develops this historical context and gives information about each of the rooms and what they represent. Apart from that, there is no labels, there is no additional information. We have done this because this exhibition can be experienced by someone who has absolutely no idea about this past, and still it would evoke some form of emotion or a feeling, because also the interviews and the voices of the survivors speak for themselves. But then on the other hand, if it's someone who is familiar with this type of history, who is familiar with the social, cultural context of Bulgaria or like ex-Soviet countries, they would like have more information, and the installation would be much more kind of like deep and intricate.
Maybe in the same way in which our conversations and encounters with survivors have created, there is a sliding scale of understanding, of meaning, of comprehension, and of witnessing. It is possible to enter the pavilion and, be there for 3 minutes and have an impression, and that will be a particular impression. And it's possible to spend 3 hours in the pavilion and you will not have exhausted all of the permutations of what happens. The oral material is about just under an hour. The non-verbal material is, in the most reductive sense, about an hour and a half, but because these things never really intersect with one another in the same way, the space is more of an organism, and I think is much more characteristic of intersubjective experience than it is of a sort of durational or time-based media that is typically exhibited in gallery spaces, where there might be a screening time, you enter, it's linear, or there's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end. There's no beginning, middle, and end with the Neighbours. You don't need to enter at any particular moment, and you're not able to anticipate what you will hear when you walk in. And in that sense, there is an invitation to navigate these fragments and to navigate this ambiguous location, which is straddling the former sites of political violence and the sites of our conversations.
I completely agree with everyone, but I do want to say something. The interviews themselves are extremely concrete. And so everything discussed until now is put in conversation with these very concrete, specific, uttered words and narratives. And when we talked about who some of the people are and who some of the victims are, there is also the experience, it's actually one of Krasimira's interviews, of Bulgaria's Muslim minorities who were subject to political repression. And for instance, you don't need to know anything about the historical context, but you have this very powerful interview of a man that Krasimira is speaking with, and he describes his experiences about being forced to change his name. and his refusal to change his name and the violence that inflicted on his community. And I think this is really key, that you don't need the historical context when you have a very concrete testimony. And that is the individual, the human contact that is conveyed as well in these spaces. And I think it's also really important, and I say this, as part of this collective, but also as a scholar who's worked on Eastern Europe for now over 20 years in North America and in Western Europe, that is in Western spaces. There is a tendency when you come from the former East or the current East, however you want to debate that you always need to sort of justify the existence, make it palpable, make it tangible, make it understandable. I think that's wrong. I think that it is very important to forefront lived experiences that are different from the Western Eurocentric, Anglocentric point of view in and of themselves, on their own terms, and not in a way that makes them digestible. And I think this is the fine line that you straddle when you work in the former communist and socialist space. You do not need to justify your existence and why you're doing what you're doing. You just need to speak and be heard, of course, to be heard. Active unsilencing is what we call this installation and the work in general, yes.
And now we are kind of halfway through the Biennale till November. It's going, so that's amazing that so many people can see the work. And have you been actually witnessing people looking at the space, interacting with the space? What's the kind of your experience there?
We have seen different reactions of people, from talking to people who simply visited Bulgaria during the communist regime and were detained by the secret police because they took photographs and were foreigners coming from the West, to meeting people whose grandfathers were sent to the camps and who would break down when they would enter. We've left this book at the entrance before you enter for comments, and it's strange, expected but strange, to open it and find that sometimes there would be 2-3 pages of writing by one person who would just tell us the whole story, everything they know. They would just leave it. There is one sentence that repeats through the whole comments book, which is, the same glass vitrine is still in the home of my grandparents. And that sentence is just every 5 pages someone writes it. And it's really, I think, because when we were preparing for the Biennale, we had absolutely, or at least I didn't have any clue how many Bulgarians go to the Biennale, whether Bulgarians would ever be even an audience in a place that's so inaccessible, expensive and far away. And of course we thought that it would be mainly like an international audience, and that of course the history is universal, unfortunately, like political violence happens till this day, this very moment. So we thought in that way the installation could be understood. For example, in the opening of the pavilion, I was speaking in the end of the evening to these 3 artists and curators from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan who were telling me their stories and telling how they really liked the show because they all kind of saw the work, went outside and just shared everything they knew about their ancestors and cried together. There are lots of people who sometimes would enter and kind of catwalk through the space and get out, and I think that's just the Biennale. So I think it's like a mix of all kinds of encounters, because I think sometimes also the work it requires a lot from you to see the work as well. And Venice is a really kind of a strange place that requires that as a whole, because there is a show every 5 meters.
Something I think that all the artists had anticipated and knew that it would happen. Even though I knew it, I still found it absolutely astonishing, is how people, after they see the show, are really open to talking about their personal experiences. I've had friends which I've knew for like a really long time, and I didn't know their personal stories, but after the installation they would open up and they would talk about it. And I'm saying that just to kind of like highlight this idea of the exhibition space, not only as something, as a place where you go, you see a work and even like talk about it, which obviously it should do, but it's about like embodying and also through the conversation and through the discussion which follows to have like at least to start a healing effect. Think about the exhibition space as a space of collective care.
one of the big questions that we have been asking ourselves is, does the work we do have a social function, right? Can it go beyond what it is? What are the boundaries? And I think that with this pavilion very intentionally, and with this exhibition very intentionally, not just at Venice, but it's in its previous iterations in Sofia and in Toronto and in Princeton, we have always aimed to create a space of encounters that will prompt an engagement with it. And in the booklets, we're actually on book 3 already. Of the comments. And what is really...
Wow, that's crazy.
I know. Something like 30,000 people have already passed through the pavilion. And what's really, really powerful about it is that, for me, the testimonies of people, of course, who have had family members who've gone through these very same camps are very heartbreaking. But what is equally moving to me is to see words in languages that I don't understand. I don't read Mandarin, I don't read German, I don't read Spanish, or Portuguese for that matter, but I'm reading these testimonies of people from very distant parts of the world. And, through friends or, my colleagues have taught me how to use the Google Translate app. So for menus initially, but now I use it for the catalogs. And I'm able to hear people from very different corners of the world who are relating to these experiences, because, as Krasimira previously mentioned, state violence and atrocities continue to happen and have happened in the past, and people always relate to them in a similar way. They're either made part of the public sphere or they're silenced. There's rarely a medium space that they occupy. And so what I have been very moved by is to read all these written testimonies that people have left in our catalog, who are saying, I relate to this. This happened in my family too, in Argentina. This is currently happening in China. And so when we read this, that's when you begin, being sometimes convinced of things that we were uncertain of at the beginning ourselves, which is, does this work beyond the Bulgarian audience? Does this work beyond the boundaries of our own imagination or our own insular decade-long conversations?
Apart from showing your work at the Biennale, you're also traveling, for example, to Berlin to speak about the work, but also about your research. And tonight you also have another of such events. Can you speak about that?
We've been on tour.
The Neighbours been
the
on
Neighbours
tour.
on tour. Yeah, we basically just flew from London to here where we were, and we did a sound performance with Julian, and we spoke about the project. And here we reunite, and actually this is going to be the first and only time when the whole collective is in one place talking about the work. It's happened before, but it's always happened with extra people, part of a bigger panel discussion, or us hosting a panel discussion. Tonight we're going to speak at Diffract Space about the work, about working as a collective, about working with erased history and a purged archive, pretty much similar things to what this whole conversation has been. But I think because this project has been going on for so long, every time we speak about it, although we have a structure of what we would say, there's always more things that are said and different things, because it's just really very long-term work. And we have another talk in Sofia in 2 days from now. And then we don't have any more talks for a bit, which is nice.
You need a break for sure. And today you will do 2 talks in 1 day. Exactly, you can practice a bit. Yeah, last but not least, I thought to ask you if you have some other recommendation of the Biennale, if there is some work or a pavilion, but not only, of course, that maybe speaks to your work as well, but perhaps is very different to your work, and you think people should see it as well when they go to Venice.
The theme of the Biennale this year is Stranieri ovunque, foreigners everywhere. And there is this centering of alienation, estrangement, and marginality as something that is not limited to being on either side of a national border, but that is something, in Adriano Pedrosa's curatorial words, there is something that is a kind of a transnational experience. And I've been really pleased to see history and historical, archival work at the forefront of this edition of the Biennale. I'm thinking, for example, of the Egyptian pavilion, which has this almost kind of archival opera, this musical performance that is on a screen, but that also kind of extends into the pavilion space. And it is, in a sense, a kind of revisionist reenactment of the moment of the British invasion of Alexandria in the 19th century. And you have, for example, the Irish pavilion, where there are questions of domesticity and queerness and property relations that are also played out in this operatic manner. And then you have the Nigerian pavilion. It is almost kind of a taking stock of pasts, presents, and futures as part of what is Nigeria? Is there such a thing as a Nigerian imaginary that we can speak of at the cross currents of past, present, and future? You have the German pavilion that is also a kind of questioning of the distinctness of past, present, and future. And so there is some, I think, an overwhelming kind of historical turn, a turn to kind of empirical rigor as a way of opening up broader and more universal questions. And so the thing that we often sort of refer to as practice-based or practice-led research, while it is not necessarily the formal thematization, I think we are seeing research-based work becoming a kind of central methodology for socially engaged work.
Yeah, my recommendations are the Polish pavilion and the Ukrainian pavilion. That's my favorite pavilions, especially because of not only shared history and context, but also shared lack of resources and making the best out of it, which is very different than Western pavilions, where like the work could be great, but the conditions of working, existing, and being in that state can't be compared at all. So the Polish pavilion for me, it was really, really strong and really
Open
interesting.
Group.
Open group.
All right. Well, last but not least, let's speak about food. I have to ask this question because it's also a nice ending, kind of transition to the city life here in Berlin and the rest of your day. So since this is Kitchen Conversations, the last question on the podcast is always about favorite food from home, thinking also what home is for you and if food can connect us to something familiar and homey or it can actually act in a different way. So would love each of you to share something about your favorite tastes, kitchens of a place that is familiar to you and feels like home.
Yeah, there is just so much food that I like, and especially now that it's past lunchtime, I'm kind of hungry, so I think we can go for another hour speaking about Bulgarian food. I just thought about the story of we have a dish literally called chicken with rice. It's made in the oven, like first you fry some onion with the rice, maybe you can put a carrot, then you lay over everything in a tray and you put it in the oven with the chicken and the stock, which you boil the chicken and you use the stock. So this dish, when I was little, because my parents emigrated to London when I was 3, and I left to live with my grandparents, and I had 2 pairs of grandparents, which lived across the street, and I liked it so much that every time when I moved from one place to another, which was every week, I would request this dish because they would ask me, what do you want to eat? So I was eating it basically twice per day because I was obsessed with it. And my grandmothers were in like an informal competition of who makes it
the better one.
And of course I always said, it's you to both of them.
Of course.
So I kept them happy and they kept me happy by cooking it.
I will say 2 things which I will just say in Bulgarian and I won't be able to explain them. So I'll ask here the audience to help me out. One is something that everyone hates, but I truly love, Gris-Halva. It's like a dessert from poverty, and it used to be given to me when I was in kindergarten. And it's this solid block of something that's like flour, and it's really just like some type of flour with sugar, and that's it. And it looks like gray and beige and just really terrible as a color. It's the best. And then the other one is Katschamak, which is like polenta. But when I say that it's polenta, I kind of kill it straight away by saying it because it's not, but it is like. And then in my kind of a region where I am from in Bulgaria, it's very famous with Katschamak, Plovdiv Rodopite. So it's like done very slowly, like it's a slow cooked meal. It takes like, when you do it properly, it takes like 4 hours to make it. And it's again like this type of flour. So it's just flour with like butter, cooked very slowly, and it's like yellow, again maybe same shade, so maybe it's something to do with flour and same shades of color that I like. And sometimes you put like a bit of feta cheese on top, or a bit of mushrooms, a bit of red pepper, and it's really, really nice.
So funny that like the 2.5 years ago when we spoke, you gave very different foods also. I love that.
Okay, I'm in a dramatic mood, so I'm gonna raise the stakes here.
Go for it.
So something that's been on my mind in recent times has been maybe the question of whether nationhood is nothing more than a momentary fever dream, and that in the sort of global moment right now where you have these kind of resurgent nationalisms and also kind of decolonial critique and kind of this sort of this kind of assessment of imperialism. I think it's interesting to remember that empire is the longer story in a kind of a transhistorical sense. And in that sense, I'm going to say that my favorite dish is something that is hardly Bulgarian and that only requires crossing into the border of Turkey to realize such a thing, Mish-mash, which I unfortunately can't remember the Turkish word for, but it's the same dish. And the kind of blurry post-Ottoman quality of this dish, I think, is an important reminder for how these projects for, ethno-national and linguistic distinctness really fall apart if we take a step to the left or to the right. And so,
can you tell what it is?
Yeah,
I never had that.
My favorite version of it is roasted. Roasted peppers with the skin peeled off, tomatoes. If you have the time or energy or affection, you can maybe peel the skin of the tomatoes as well, and onions, and these things all come together with some eggs. You can go more or less on the eggs, and some white cheese afterwards. Not to give a national specificity to what kind of cheese. I think we all know that the Bulgarian white cheese is the best. And then you can put some parsley on top, some garlic if you like it that way. It's a lovely thing that's kind of like more and less than an omelet at the same time.
I have an idea already.
The toasted bread.
And toasted crusty bread.
Lilia.
Okay, I'll do something different.
Last but not least.
I'm not a cook. I don't cook. But I enjoy food and I enjoy eating. But I'll talk to you about something else. Because I can never disconnect what I eat from what I do. In fact, I can never disconnect anything from what I do, and I refuse to. Regardless of all the therapy advice you get, that one should. So I grew up in communist Bulgaria, and I enjoyed all the traditional dishes that everybody has spoken of so far. I love stuffed peppers, for instance. I love stuffed peppers. I love chicken with rice. I love Katschamak, the polenta dish, or mamaliga, as it's known in Romania and northern Bulgaria. So I love all of these dishes. They are part of my childhood. And in fact, what's particular about Bulgaria, I think here, in a post-imperial moment, is in order to make the Mish-mash, you had a special device where you roast the peppers. It's called chushkupek. It is something that we could not put in our installation, but it's something we really wanted. So all this to say, my childhood in communist Bulgaria in the 1980s was infused with these foods. And then I was part of the million people diaspora that left in the early 90s as the wall came down. And I grew up in North America. So all that food was taken away from me, right? I had to replace, the stuffed peppers with poutine in Montreal, which is the French fries with melted cheese and gravy. And I fully switched to North American cuisine. And then when I returned to Bulgaria to do the research, I returned to this food. But it was no longer for me the context of the family where my grandmother would make the best chicken and rice, or my mom would make the best, Katschamak. It was the people who were connected to the camps. So I started eating stuffed peppers again, and I started eating these dishes again, but listening to these stories. And so for me, the return to this food was not simply to return to my childhood experience, but to try and understand people's lived experience of violence by eating. Because you can never just sit and listen to people's stories. You always have to have, specifically in the Balkans, in this culture, food. And so I would eat the traditional meal, banica, every time I would be welcomed. And I would eat so many stuffed peppers, and I didn't feel like eating. Because initially when you start listening to these stories, the last thing you want to do is eat food. But I had to. And so my relationship to that food fully transformed. And I will end here.
I think that's a beautiful moment to round up this interview. Thanks for being here, for sharing your research or a small part of it. And I'm very excited to bring this interview out there and invite people to see your work and follow your further artistic, historic, academic, and cultural and all other work you do. Thank you so much.
As well. It's really, really nice to be here and to be talking with you.
Thank you so much. Yes, you've truly enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for the invite and the interest in our work.
Thanks. And this was it for today. Thank you for reaching till the end of this episode. The next one is coming in 4 weeks, always on Monday. Please follow the podcast and leave a rating. I'm also happy to hear your feedback, so feel free to write me via Instagram or by email. All the needed info you will find in the show notes of this episode. In the meantime, take good care and we hear each other soon.